Watershed Watch is a small nonprofit organization, a salmon conservation charity that operates in Coquitlam and focuses on issues that affect salmon all around British Columbia. In particular, we've been looking at things like harvest impacts on salmon. We've been looking at the impacts of salmon farms on wild salmon for about a dozen years. And we take on a whole bunch of other issues around water and salmon habitat. And in particular, we've been looking at the impacts of pathogens on salmon that come from salmon farms in the last little while. Wild salmon are an icon in British Columbia. We have 6 species of wild salmon, including the well-known Fraser sockeye. And in some areas they're doing okay, but in other areas they're not doing so well. We've just recently seen a almost 2-decade-long decline in Fraser sockeye, which prompted the first ever federal inquiry into the decline of Fraser River sockeye. But salmon are threatened by all kinds of things out there right now, unfortunately, including loss of habitat through development, through loss of water, through hydroelectric projects, things like that. They're also affected by climate change, in particular in British Columbia right now. There's been quite a few studies done on thermal impacts of climate change on Fraser sockeye. And amazingly, we've seen the Fraser River warm up by almost 2 degrees Celsius in the last 30 or 40 years, and that's quite a bit. It doesn't sound like a lot when you just think about it, but to a salmon that depends on cold water and clean water, this has been quite an impact, and we've seen quite a few dead sockeye incidents because of overheating of their habitat in the Fraser River. So we have to be worried about those kind of things. In British Columbia, we have what are arguably the worst water laws in North America for protecting salmon, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. We've had a lawyer look at this and produce a report for us. Right now, we don't have any protection for groundwater in British Columbia, and the groundwater is really important to salmon for keeping their streams cool and keeping them flowing. But you can go in and take as much groundwater out as you want now. So one of the things Watershed Watch has been trying to do is get government to modernize our water laws to give some degree of protection to wild salmon. That includes protecting groundwater and also making sure there's enough flow in the rivers. So those are some of the issues we work on. We do quite a bit of work on habitat restoration in British Columbia as well. There's a lot that can be done to repair habitat. A lot of it has been damaged in the past, and there's just ongoing threats in terms of loss of salmon habitat and overharvesting of fish as well.
For quite a while, we've been concerned about a parasite, sea lice, coming from salmon farms, and there's been a fair bit of work on that done in British Columbia, including some research that Craig and I have been involved in, looking at salmon farms and how they can amplify levels of sea lice, which is this parasite, and be spread to wild juvenile pink salmon, particularly in areas such as the Broughton Archipelago in British Columbia. So there's a lot of concern around the amplification of these parasites from farms going to wild fish and affecting their populations. Now, we recently saw through the federal inquiry that investigated a whole host, or whole abundance of threats to wild salmon, the threat of disease and viruses and pathogens coming from salmon farms. And that kind of opened the floodgates in terms of the public's opinion and knowledge on different pathogens coming from salmon farms. So we're just starting to work on that now, as well as a whole host of other researchers are really opening the doors on a lot of new research looking into viruses that may be affecting salmon and other pathogens. One particular thing that we did look at was a study looking at Cultus Lake trout, cutthroat trout, and we were working with a scientist at Simon Fraser University, and we found that when we tested these fish for various viruses, we did see positive test results for a virus called piscine reovirus. So we're not sure if that the total sequence of that virus is present here, but it's the strain that we did see. The reports suggested that it was a European strain of this virus. So that raises questions as to how potentially this virus got here. Some think that some of these viruses may be transported here through the salmon farming industry, because say they import various substances like eggs, and it's been shown that the industry has transported viruses to other countries, such as Chile. So a lot of people think right now that this potentially could be a threat here, this importation of new viruses through the salmon farming industry. So that's another threat.
Well, it's quite obvious that water is an important habitat for salmon, and water is quite threatened around British Columbia and around the world. Many people have said the next great wars are not going to be over oil, they're going to be over water, and we hear about that every day. We have glaciers shrinking in British Columbia, and that's a real concern because the glaciers are what are supplying the major amount of water for many of our streams now. And so many of the scientific studies that are being done show that we're having less water in some of the rivers that salmon frequent, and this is only going to lead to problems for salmon down the road. We have increasing climate change impacts. We mentioned that earlier, and when we get a warming temperatures, we get warmer water, and that really causes more stress in these fish. It causes their hearts to beat faster. It causes them to have more physical stress when they're migrating, and it causes fairly large die-offs of salmon in certain areas when the conditions are really severe. So we really have a lot of concerns about the quality, including pollution and pollutants, and the quantity of water in the future in British Columbia. And that's a grave concern, because we are one of the major wild salmon producing countries in the world here, and we're going to see that, that lofty title being eroded in the future if we don't do something to protect our fish from poor water laws and poor laws around climate change.
With reference to aquaculture and salmon farming, we learned through the inquiry, I think, that there's a fair bit of risk associated with this industry. Risk to wild salmon, specifically sockeye and other species. And really it's an easy fix. So these farms are located on the out-migration routes of wild salmon. And so as I mentioned earlier, there is a big potential for them to spread parasites and particularly diseases such as viruses to wild fish and impact them. So I think it just makes sense to clear these farms away from wild salmon migration routes. It's as simple as that. It's too big of a risk. We've seen a lot of science that suggests it's a huge risk, and we should move these farms away from wild salmon routes. One way, a place they could go is we could transition this industry to a different format, to land-based closed containment systems. There are a whole host of problems associated with these open net salmon farms, not just diseases, but they also spread waste, toxins, pesticide into the environment. But if they were closed systems on land, the bulk of these problems would be solved. So, and that was a recommendation that was made by a provincial committee a number of years ago that apparently seem to have been ignored. So we're hoping that another recommendation coming from the inquiry identifies salmon farms as a big risk to wild salmon, and that there's a movement of these farms away from wild salmon out-migration routes.
Citizens can do a lot more than they think. They can speak out and they can say that they value wild salmon. There's no question about it. Watershed Watch and Skeena Wild did a poll over a year ago asking British Columbians to rate salmon in terms of their value to British Columbians, and they rated them very, very highly. They actually said that we weren't doing enough to protect salmon, and we weren't doing enough to ensure that government gives salmon top priority in terms of resource protection. So citizens are concerned. They show that they're very caring, And one of the things that we can do is we can complain about recent changes into federal legislation around salmon. You've probably already heard that the Federal Fisheries Act has just been severely weakened. And the reason, which came out in a newspaper story, was to make it easier to develop due to industrial developments in Canada, in particular pipelines and things like that. And so now it's going to be easier to develop around salmon habitat, and probably going to see more damage to salmon habitat. And you know, this is a democracy. Last time we checked, and we need to be very careful about where government is going without citizen input in terms of environmental protection. We've seen weakening of the Environmental Assessment Act, just recently the Navigable Waters Protection Act. And you know, it's pretty easy just to throw up your hands and say, oh, we can't do anything about it. But ordinary citizens are quite powerful in terms of you know, voicing their opinions, writing letters and emails, and you know, joining groups that are concerned about these kind of issues, and they can make a difference. So we need to see a strong wild salmon policy. During the federal sockeye inquiry, there was a lot of focus on Canada's wild salmon policy. It's a very good policy, very good policy. It talks about protecting genetic diversity of salmon, which is going to allow them to adapt to climate change in the future. But we're not protecting the full genetic diversity of wild salmon yet under the wild salmon policy, because there's too much of an industrial bias in our resource management, and there's not enough about protecting the resources and not extracting them as fast as possible. So, you know, we need to rethink the kind of protection we have. We need to give, you know, a new emphasis on protecting wild salmon and the wild salmon policy. And we also have, coming out very shortly, the final report of the Cohen sockeye inquiry. And this should be of vital interest to not only British Columbians, but everyone in Canada. It's the first ever federal inquiry into the fate of a wild fish in British Columbia. We didn't have one after the stock of cod collapsed in Atlantic Canada, right? There was no inquiry. But we've had an inquiry. It's been 3 years now since it was announced, waiting the final report. And citizens should be concerned what this report says, and hopefully you know, be watching very closely to see how the federal government treats the recommendations. Are they treating them you know, carefully? Are they treating them seriously? Are they actually going to act on these recommendations that are going to be coming out? Or are they going to be dusting them you know, to the corner and dusting them under the carpet and just saying, okay, that was the $26 million that we just spent, but we don't really like what the inquiry said. So, you know, we need citizens to be watchdogs on these things and to pay attention. And groups like Watershed Watch are going to be reporting back on what the inquiry said, and you know, we'll be gauging the reaction from both politicians and the public on the inquiry.